Welcome to episode 4 of the Perfect Storm podcast, an ongoing discussion around the convergence of three big ideas: mental health, organized religion, and creative aspirations. I'm your host, Michael Varnado, and I thank you for listening. If you're jumping in at episode 4, no worries. However, for context, you might find it helpful to start from the beginning of the series. In previous episodes, I said that I wanted to tell my story as it continues to unfold. I believe being candid about one's story will encourage others to carefully examine their own narratives. I wanted to start this project by laying down a foundation. I introduced the concept behind Perfect Storm, as well as the topics of mental illness and organized religion as they all pertain to my story. So now I suppose it's time to say something meaningful and profound about my creative aspirations. I thought this would be a small task, seeing as how I've spent very little time pursuing them in earnest. Turns out I was wrong, and I've got a lot to say about this topic. There are these two pictures in my mind that represent the desires I have for my life. One is the ideal picture in which I have the things I've always wanted: the thriving career in the entertainment industry, the financially abundant lifestyle, and the rich and fulfilling marriage and family life. I would become an A-list celebrity, or at least enjoy a highly rewarding career as a working comic, actor, writer, and/or recording artist. There was a time when I considered doing those things in a full-time ministry capacity, but the idea of straight Christian entertainment never held appeal for me. In the alternative picture, I would still have a healthy marriage and family life. I'm not rich, just sustainably comfortable. Since I never wanted to be a part of the rat race, in this alternative scenario, I earn my income via some clever entrepreneurial pursuit. I maintain a leisurely work-life balance. I'm not sure where I'd live. South Louisiana has swamps, forests, rivers, and lakes, but I'd love to live somewhere that also has mountains, lower humidity, and snow at Christmas time. Can't beat the food here, though. I'll soon dedicate a full episode to unpacking this alternative picture, but for now I'll just point out a few advantages. For one, I'd like to have a moderate level of recognition and esteem within my community, no matter what. However, relative obscurity certainly has advantages over the constant public scrutiny of being a celebrity. Another point is, I think that marriage and family would go a lot smoother if I worked where I lived and made it home for dinner every night. And finally, in the entertainment industry, you're always at the mercy of so many things beyond your control. As an entrepreneur, you could sort of make your own way. Despite all the different things I've ever tried to do, ultimately, I think one or both these pictures are what I've always been after. I don't think I could be satisfied with anything less. Believe me, I've tried. You might be wondering why mental health appears to be absent from these two pictures. I was not aware of my mental illness growing up, only the symptoms. I think our culture has become much more aware of the importance of mental health, but that was not the case when I grew up. Mental health was not something I thought I needed to pursue independently of those things that make up my pictures. I suppose I thought of mental health the same way people often think of happiness, as if it would be the natural byproduct of my circumstances falling into place. I've often seen these two pictures in binary terms, like I had to choose one and commit. Either picture represents a monumental undertaking with little chance of success. The pictures do overlap some, but there are also aspects of them that are mutually exclusive. I've never had the desire to develop both from the ground up at the same time, and I don't see why that would ever be necessary. I think to attempt that would be a form of self-sabotage. I could think of these pictures as representative of different stages of my life. I could see having success in the entertainment industry for a season, investing my money well, and building on that. Then, when I was ready, I could transition to a comfortable life away from the spotlight. That's a beautiful thought, and it might go that way. It's certainly been done enough times to prove that it works. And it's probably for the best that I not plan to catch lightning in a bottle and win the lottery on the same day. The idea of being a successful entrepreneur probably has its roots in my childhood. By the time I was born, my father already owned and operated a successful business. He really seemed to enjoy the autonomy and flexibility it afforded him. I entered the workforce at 13 and continued working blue-collar jobs for another 13 years before developing my freelance business. I then had a respectable 7-year run as a freelance musician. It allowed me to get married, buy a modest home, take 3 semesters at LSU, build up a nice emergency fund, pay cash for vehicles. During this time, I read a couple of books titled Rich Dad, Poor Dad and The Millionaire Next Door, both of which cemented this idea in my head of autonomy. There was one small problem. I had no idea what sort of entrepreneurial endeavors I might take on. None of the typical things people do held any appeal for me. All my aspirations are big and creative in nature. I want to be a storyteller. I've only ever considered an alternative path or tried something different out of desperation. You can only be a starving artist for so long before the trappings of an ordinary life start to seem like an improvement. Still, I knew I didn't want to end up someone's employee, completely at the mercy of a terrible boss or cold corporate entity, living paycheck to paycheck, buried in debt, stuck in traffic every morning and evening, spending my work days with a bloated belly hunched over a keyboard, only free on nights and weekends, taking my kids to the mall, maybe Disney World a couple times if we're lucky, desperate to live below my means that I may retire someday and not run out of money before the end. If I gave up on the big dream, I would have felt perpetually frustrated unless I were financially comfortable with a leisurely work-life balance. As I would later learn, having a safety net can be a bit of a double-edged sword. If I never had success in the entertainment industry, I'd probably end up accepting local church involvement as my only creative outlet. Something tells me this would have left me feeling perpetually unfulfilled. Both pictures represent exceptional outcomes, statistically speaking. Both outcomes would be the result of lots of focus, hard work, perseverance, consistently good decision-making, talent, and a fair amount of luck that most people never experience. I know I shouldn't feel entitled to either of these pictures becoming reality, but that doesn't mean I don't feel that way sometimes. I honestly hate that about myself. I'm learning now that this sense of entitlement is in part a side effect of unhealthy relationship dynamics with my mother. And that's a complicated issue which I'm only beginning to understand, so I can't break it all down right now. My relationship with my mother instilled in me this idea that I was special, destined for greatness. She also allowed me to believe I was a victim, that the rules didn't always apply to me, that I was entitled to break them as needed. She didn't enforce proper boundaries or give me consequences. I grew up not making the connection between my actions and a lot of the negative consequences I experienced out in the world. I also think this sense of entitlement comes from prosperity doctrine, which is a highly contentious issue among Christians. Even if you don't subscribe to the Joel Osteen school of thought, you probably believe there's a calling on your life, that God made you for a purpose, that He has very special plans for you. You believe you're a child of God, that Jesus died to save you, and that God wants to bless you and give you an abundant life. You probably catch yourself sometimes thinking of an abundant life in terms of financial abundance, or like a buffet of all the things you cherish most. The idea of earning things is sort of discouraged in Christianity because you're so unworthy that you could never earn anything from God. Everything that is good is given to you by God through grace, and since you couldn't possibly earn it, why try? You're a disgusting, unworthy piece of trash who deserves eternal damnation, but at the same time, God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. A bit confusing, is it not? Here's what I think. A sense of entitlement is a crutch. It makes you lazy. It's a terrible thing that will only hold you back from doing what is necessary, from being what is necessary to have success in life. Bringing it back to the two pictures, for either of them to become realized in my life, I certainly had my work cut out for me. For most people, good things don't just fall out of the sky like manna from heaven or effortlessly grow on trees like in the Garden of Eden. You must go out and work the soil, and you're never going to do that if you're governed by a sense of entitlement. Let's say that I set out to realize the first picture, the ideal scenario. What are some of the challenges I might face? There are things inherent to the industry that make it a hard nut to crack. The odds of success are terrible. For starters, all the things I want to do professionally are sort of fantasy jobs people would do whether they got paid or not. Thus, economic forces dictate that these job markets will always be saturated, the competition always hungry and desperate, making it hard to stand out and earn a good living as a creative professional. This highly competitive environment makes the industry a breeding ground for toxic people and exploitation. Bias and abuse of power are rampant. The Me Too movement notwithstanding, I've heard many celebrities admit there is a high degree of luck involved in their success. It's a very difficult career path, to say the least, and you must be able to sustain your focus and efforts for many years in the face of constant rejection to have any hope of making it. Then there's personality. Putting my trauma history aside, there are innate things about my personality that create challenges in any social situation or competitive arena, regardless of circumstance. I deal with this stuff all the time in my life. People with my personality type are more likely to share credit for their work and say it was a group effort. They're more cooperative and tend to be people pleasers, putting others' needs before their own, so they get taken advantage of and marginalized. This often leads to frustration and resentment. They are introverted, which makes networking a real challenge. They are sensitive and take criticism very personally. They aren't naturally assertive, so they don't negotiate on their own behalf very well. I used to really struggle with time management too, but I digress. Circling back to trauma history, that's certainly a good example of how an individual's circumstances can be very challenging. There was a fair amount of adversity in my life. Abuse and neglect in the home, financial hardship, bullying, religious baggage, and mental illness, to name a few. For the uninitiated, I've gone into a good bit of detail on these circumstances in previous episodes, so feel free to check that out. For now, let's just say that a person who lives in survival mode most of the time is going to struggle to self-actualize. It's a tough mental game, to be sure. I don't see myself as someone who tried and failed, or who is incapable of achieving great things. I see myself as someone who has been losing the mental game surrounding the pursuit of greatness. Let me say that again. I see myself as someone who has been losing the mental game surrounding the pursuit of greatness. Sure, there have been lots of obstacles. But the assertion that I couldn't make it as a professional entertainer while dealing with mental illness or religious baggage is empirically false. Such a notion might make sense if there weren't overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The industry is bursting with examples of people who are successful despite facing obstacles, including mental illness or religious baggage. And many people claim to be successful in part because of these aspects of their personal lives. Some of the best, most compelling storytelling comes from struggle, from creative people harnessing the power of their trauma history and pain to make art. Why would I let those things hold me back when so many successful people charged forward despite their struggles? Am I just weak? Am I just a no-talent hack? That sounds like a lot of negative self-talk, but that doesn't necessarily make it false. I think each person's story is a little different, and each person responds to trauma and adversity a little differently. The worst thing you could do is to give up, or convince yourself not to try in the first place. I believe this is where my battle lies. I was delusional as a younger person. I couldn't see either picture clearly, let alone the dichotomy between them. I didn't have that type of mental clarity as a young man. Why was I so confused? Why couldn't I see clearly what I wanted to do with my life when I was younger? For a big chunk of my life, there were these beliefs that I held about myself, about life, Christianity, and the entertainment industry that were quite problematic, driven by fear and poor judgment. I made a list of these false beliefs. I'll scroll the entire list over the closing music in case you want to check them out on YouTube. Many of these beliefs would fall apart under scrutiny, but that didn't stop them from interfering with my creative aspirations. Some things that I believed contradicted one another, so I was not only deceived, but perpetually confused as well. Conceivably, one could be confused and yet fall ass backwards into success, but it's not likely. The thing is, I eventually discarded all these beliefs. One by one, they fell away as I matured or accrued life experience. Obviously, I'm not waiting to be completely healed from the effects of past trauma before I move forward with my creative aspirations, but there are some specific things that I had to let go of in order to move forward unencumbered. Let's list them out. My need for approval from my church community. My concept of God's will, His highly specific master plan for my life. My fear that my aspirations were sinful and would incur God's wrath. My plans to get married in my 20s. And my need to be financially stable or comfortable in my 20s. Looking at those bullet points, something stands out. Whether consciously or otherwise, there were certain worst-case scenarios that really scared me. I allowed that fear to dissuade me from pursuing my ideal scenario. Then, one by one, all those worst-case scenarios I gave up so much to avoid wound up happening anyway. I was ostracized by my church community. I remained miserably single for many years, and I didn't get married until long after most of my friends and peers had already started having kids. God never revealed His ultra-specific master plan for my life, so I certainly missed that. I experienced much financial instability and lack in my 20s and total financial ruin at one point in my 30s. Don't let fear control you, please, whatever you do. Ricky Gervais is sort of a role model for me these days. I see a few parallels between our lives. As a child, his mother attempted to raise him with a Christian foundation. Ricky turned away from Christianity in favor of atheism, which isn't exactly my viewpoint, but he enjoys pointing out the absurdity of his former belief system. He loves animals. He doesn't want kids, and neither did I until I had my daughter. He was a failed recording artist in his 20s before working in an office setting for a significant part of his life. It wasn't until he was around my age that he produced a TV series based on his experiences working in an office. Gervais was able to cast himself as the lead, David Brent, a character based on various people he'd encountered in the workplace. The successful UK television series was later remade in the US. He went on to produce stand-up specials, act in films, and create and star in multiple series for TV and streaming. He's hosted the Golden Globes multiple times and has been rich and famous for some time now. He's a bit overweight and tends to fluctuate. He's grumpy, but smart, sincere, honest. He's done everything I ever hoped to do in my own career. I see a lot of myself in him, whether he would agree or not, and he gives me hope that I might be able to accomplish something worthwhile as an entertainer before it's all over. Once I completed the final outline for this episode, I started to doubt it. I started to think it was a fabrication or perhaps a retcon of my history. It took 15 to 20 years to slowly untangle the mess of my upbringing and arrive at my current perspective. Some contributing factors were things beyond my control. I've thought about how much of the past 20 years seemed necessary and how much was just needless suffering. It made me really wonder how it could have happened differently and still resulted in the same mental clarity I now enjoy at 40. How could all this healing and shift in perspective have happened on a hyper-accelerated timeline so that I could start to pursue my creative aspirations unencumbered back in my 20s? So, I made a bulleted list of events in my own history that were necessary for me to reach this point. And they lined up perfectly with what I said about letting go of false beliefs. I do wish it would have happened faster, but it's too late to recapture the last 20 years of my life. Thing is, it's not too late for you. You can avoid the mistakes I've made and seek help from a mental health professional. If you or someone you know may be struggling with mental illness, please get help. Don't waste your life trying to white knuckle it. Don't put it off. Do it now.